The Appetite for Power. If you want to read a novel that deals with these issues very powerfully and even in a funny way, it's Don DeLillo's White Noise, 1986. I know, before the internet, but he's dealing with these concerns and articulating a vision for how to be human in the digital age, even back then. And this is a line from that novel. You could put your faith in technology. It got you here. It can get you out. This is the whole point of technology. It creates an appetite for immortality on one hand. It threatens universal extinction on the other. That's it right there, isn't it? All right. So as I was thinking about this, I'm like, well, at PRS, we like to go back as far as we can and see what's the best that has been written and thought about a topic. And I'm like, you know what? I'm thinking what we're really talking about here is selling our souls tonight, the appetite for power. So I'm like, well, we actually have a lot of stories about selling our souls. And it begins in the Western creation myth of Eden, the Garden of Eden, where there's a serpent. And this serpent is, he's more crafty, the text says, than any of the other animals the Lord God had made. Of course, the whole thing's a setup by a God who likes to play jokes. But there's also some wisdom in here because the serpent is a trickster, and we know that tricksters are frustrating, confusing, disgusting at times, but they also are our greatest teachers at times, and we need them. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is a teacher, and he or she or it tells the truth. What do I mean? Well, listen. Now the serpent was more crafty, and there's some really interesting play on the Hebrew word here. It's a rhyme with the Hebrew word for nude, right? So it's a rhyme. So it's like shrewd and nude. The serpent is shrewd, and he shows them that they're nude. That's kind of the play that's at work here. It's really interesting. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman said to the serpent, we can eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said you should not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you'll die. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die." And she doesn't. Right then. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The serpent knows what God knows. Interesting. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. Not unlike how we approach technology. Oh yeah, we'll do that. Let's split the atom. That'll be fine. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, the text says. So don't let some evangelists tell you that Eve is at fault here. I mean, according to the literal meaning of the Bible, he was there the whole time. Who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. And then this is much later in the chapter. And then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." The serpent was right. And now he might reach out his hand and also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. And therefore, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and the a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. And so the serpent brought knowledge, not just knowledge, but the same knowledge that God has. And God acknowledges this in the story. The man and woman have now become like us, like gods, knowing good and evil, knowing things. And this is a story we tell ourselves all over the world and throughout history, that to know what the gods know is what makes us human. Well, no, it's what makes us divine. The limitations the gods put on that knowledge is what makes us human. My favorite creation story that I tell you any chance I can get is from the Popol Vuh, the great Mayan text, where the gods try to create human beings. They keep messing up, and the human beings keep getting wiped out in a flood, or it rains and they're made of mud, so they melt. It's human creation by committee of the gods, and they just are so bad at it. So they get together, all right, let's get our shit together. Come on. We got to make human beings, and we got to make them right. And then they make them like gods. And they're like, uh-oh, right? And I love this line so much. And so the text reads, and so the gods breathed on their minds like breath on a mirror, so that they could not see all that the gods can see. And the genius of that text is the way you get the breath, the fog off your mind, is you read the text that you're reading at that moment, the Popol Vuh. Absolutely beautiful. Selling Our Souls, they're the fallen angels. There's a great book from the Jewish Apocrypha called First Enoch, Second Enoch, and it says this. It's about the fallen angels. And the third was named Gadriel. He it is who showed the children of men all the blows of death. The blows of death. And he led astray Eve and showed the weapons of death to the sons of men, the shield and the coat of mail and the sword for battle and all the weapons of death to the children of men. And from his hand they have proceeded against those who dwell on the earth from that day and evermore. And the fourth was called Penamue, and he taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet. And he taught them all the secrets of their wisdom, and he instructed mankind in writing with ink and paper. I told you writing was one of our oldest technologies. And thereby many sinned from writing with ink and paper. Thereby many sinned from eternity to eternity and until this day. For men were not created for such a purpose, to give confirmation to their good faith with pen and ink. For men were created exactly like the angels, to the intent that they should continue pure and righteous, and death, which destroys everything, could not have taken hold of them. But through this, their knowledge, I went too far. Through this, their knowledge, they are perishing. Through their knowledge, they are perishing. And through this power, death is consuming me. Okay, so we have always had these stories of technology and its dangers, the appetite for power, and the dangers inherent therein. And of course, we have the wonderful stories of selling our souls to the devil, which is more often than not for knowledge. Another word for knowledge is science. Science is very much related to technology. Technology, as we understand it now, is the products of the process of science. So we have sold our souls for this knowledge, and we like to tell that story because it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. We give up too much. I love these. I had not heard of Simonder. I love Icelandic myth, and if you've ever been to Iceland, it's a unique place where mythology is still very much alive in the culture. They don't have this problem of saying, oh, that's a fairy tale, or that's a myth, that's a falsehood. They live together in Iceland very nicely. And there is this dude, Simander, who repeatedly tricks the devil, right? So the devil's a kind of trickster, and the genius is to be able to trick him back, right? If you can do that, you're a hero. I love this story. And this is one of the more famous stories of Simander. He made a pact with the devil to get to Europe, because if you're in Iceland, you're always trying to get to Europe, because it's Iceland, it's a big island in the middle of the ocean. And because Iceland is awesome, you're also trying to get back. So he tells the devil, listen, I need to get back home. The devil's in Europe, of course. And he says, listen, can you get me back to Iceland? And the devil says, yeah, no problem, but I'm going to need something in return. And so the devil takes the form of a seal. And Simander rides the seal from Europe to Iceland. And then right as the seal lands in Iceland, Simander takes the Bible and hits him over the head with it until he dies. Yes, the Bible as a weapon originally for seal clubbing, apparently. There's another story of Simander, again, who sailed to Europe to learn the dark arts. But there was no schoolmaster present. This is great storytelling, right? There was no schoolmaster at the School of the Dark Arts. So every time the students requested information, the book would appear the next morning, or the words would be written upon the walls. And above the entrance to the school, it read, "You may come on in. Your soul is now lost." Awesome. There is, of course, Johann Georg Faust, for whom the legend is, for whom the play is named. The legends is the play, is actually based on a character who lived from 1480 to 1540, an alchemist, a practitioner of necromancy, and we have some early records of his exploits into the late 16th century. And of course, Christopher Marlowe would come along and create a play based on this legend, this story, called The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus, performed in London, 1592. There is Pan Twardowski, 16th century Polish legend, a nobleman who lived in Krakow in the 16th century, and he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for great knowledge and magical powers. However, Twardowski wanted to outwit the devil by including a special clause in the contract stating that the devil could only take Twardowski's soul to hell during a visit to Rome. I know, lots of things to say about that. And so Twardowski never intended to go there, of course. And so what happens is Twardowski is ready to return, and he stops and stays in an inn called, I'm mispronouncing it in Polish, I'm sure, but it's RZYM, Ryzm, which is Rome in Polish. So he did stay in Rome, the Rome Inn. And then, of course, there is Goethe, who does probably the more well-known Faust, 1749 to 1832, Goethe lived. So this is a story we love, and we are still doing this. We mentioned at the very beginning of our series, how is there a technology we have not chosen to adopt? I can't think of any. Maybe you can. If we can do it, we will do it. This is selling our soul for knowledge, right? Because there is always, always, always a price for obtaining this knowledge, for obtaining this technology. So I want to take the remainder of the time to talk about some contemporary thinkers and theorists and historians and cultural critics who have outlined how we've sold our souls, how the users have become used. And one of these is the great Lewis Mumford, who lived from 1895 to 1990. Mumford's one of those guys that I kept kind of seeing everywhere, but never followed up on. So I'm happy to do that tonight because he was amazing. He wrote a book in 1934 called Technics and Civilization. And it's it's first in a 4-volume series called The Renewal of Life. This is, back in the time when Manly Hall was writing, when you did these big tomes, that covered everything. So Renewal of Life was Technics and Civilization, the Culture of Cities. And if you ask people about Mumford, you'll probably, if they know him, they will know him for his writings on cities. The Condition of Man, 1944, and The Conduct of Life, 1951. I miss these great works that cover everything from ethics to metaphysics to technology. So he says there are three ages of technology. The eotechnic, from the Greek word eos for dawn, which he means the beginning of technology. So he's going to understand technology as a mechanical kind of thing, not in terms of writing, say, as I do, as I consider that a technology. 1000 to 1800, and he says that the innovation here was time. And we should do a series on time, because time is a created thing. It's only after Newton that we come to think of it as a thing out there that affects us. We created it. I mean, what do you think happened before there were clocks? I mean, time was a very different thing. It was different for people at different places on the globe. And if you think about it, as I have thought about it a lot, time flows differently for all of us now. If you're in a wreck, you know how time slows down and you can see things happening like frame by frame. Or sometimes time speeds up, like when you get my age, you're like, wait, what? Like, that was 2010? That was like 2 years ago, right? So time, he says this, moment to moment, it turns out, is not God's conception or nature's. It is man conversing with himself about and through a piece of machinery he has created, right? One that I now wear on my body, and it taps me. What are you saying? Oh, I achieved my move goal. Awesome. Thank you, Apple Watch. It is not God's conception nor nature's. It is human beings conversing with ourselves about and through a piece of machinery. And then he says there is the Paleotechnic, 1700 to 1900. And this is basically capitalism. So he says we took, now there's more than clocks, obviously, 1000 to 1800. And he spends his work, Technics and Civilization, talking about these various inventions, these various technologies, or techniques as he calls them. It was here, he says, 1700 to 1900, that we began to turn these things against each other. Right? So technology, inventions, machines is what he's really talking about. They serve us. And eventually, we turn them on each other. He says this, the Paleotechnic time is marked by an upthrust into barbarism, aided by the very forces and interests which originally have been directed toward the conquest of the environment, right, and the perfection of human nature. So originally, the technology becomes a way, it's the old form of magic, right, which is manipulating nature for your own ends. And then it becomes, and then it was also about making us better. But eventually, given who we are as a species, we use these things against each other. It's hard not to think of the opening of 2001, A Space Odyssey, as I talk about this, where the apes are living with the boars or whatever they are, and one of them one day finds a bone, and he's just playing around with the bone, and then he starts hitting things. And then the next thing you see are these animals falling, right? And then they turn on each other. There is also the neo-technic, and this is 1900 to 1930. This is Mumford's time, and it's energy. He says this: vacuum pumps driven by electric motors are forced into American household vacuum pumps for the purpose of cleaning an obsolete form of floor covering, the carpet or rug, whose appropriateness for use in interiors, if it did not disappear with the caravans where it originated, certainly passed out of existence with rubber heels and steam-heated houses. Okay. To count such pathetic examples of waste to the credit of the machine is like counting the rise in the number of constipation remedies as proof of the benefits of leisure. Okay, he's off on a little tangent there, isn't he? One can only imagine what he would think of today. His point, this book and the other books I'm going to talk about are magisterial books, and I am not doing them justice tonight, but I did want to introduce you to them because they're so important for the appetite for power. We got into this last time. We couldn't really talk about truth last time without going into power. His central thesis is this, that biotechnics resists megatechnics. In other words, the human resists the non-human. The human resists technology. And he was, I almost used the word naively, but he's not naive. He is just, let's say, idealistic about biotechnics, about the natural, but especially the human natural, serving as a brake for these developments, these megatechnics, these large-scale changes and inventions in culture. I don't know. Here's some more from Lewis Mumford. Mechanical instruments, potentially a vehicle of rational human purposes, are scarcely a blessing when they enable the gossip of the village idiot and the deeds of the thug to be broadcast to 1 million people each day. I'm sorry that's not relevant in 2020, but that was 1933. That's before television came to America, right? The gossip of the village idiot and the deeds of the thug to be broadcast to 1 million people each day. War is the supreme drama of a completely mechanized society. That's pretty sharp, right? You have all this technology, you have all this weaponry. War is the play that you use for these props. And you have to use these props, right? I mean, have you seen a police force in any major or even mid-sized city? This is an army. In fact, I think that's where they get their equipment. Seriously, I think they buy it from the army. My thesis, and here's his central thesis again, my thesis, to put it bluntly, is that from late Neolithic times in the Near East, right down to our own today, two technologies have recurrently existed side by side. One authoritarian, the other democratic. The first system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable. The other human-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. I don't know. I kind of feel like we're living that out right now still. How else are users used in the appetite for power? I love this guy. First of all, his last name's Winner. I mean, come on. Look at him. He plays in some punk bands, and he's a professor. I love this guy. His most well-known work is an essay called Do Artifacts Have Politics? Do artifacts, do human creation have politics? Yes, they do. You're probably not surprised to hear that. He writes this: one can point to Baron Haussmann's broad Parisian thoroughfares. If you've been to Paris, you know these, right? Thoroughfares. Engineered at Louis Napoleon's direction to prevent any recurrence of street fighting of the kind that took place during the Revolution of 1848. Or one can visit any number of grotesque concrete buildings or huge plazas constructed on American university campuses during the late 60s and early 70s to diffuse student demonstrations. Technological change expresses a panoply of human motives, not the least of which is the desire to have some dominion over others. So, okay, we know that these things can be used in this way, and he makes that distinction in his essay, that we have typically thought of technology as something outside of us, a tool that we use, and it's agnostic. It's not for or against anybody or anything. It's a tool, and so it can be used. And he's trying to collapse that distinction, and I think he's right. For example, he says technical arrangements are forms of order. Technical arrangements themselves are forms of order. And as Foucault tells us, that order is laced with power. The order of things is about the diffusion of the accumulation and diffusion of power. For example, and I didn't know this, you may have heard of Robert Moses, who basically developed New York as a city civil planner, civil engineer. He says this, I don't remember this, and maybe it's not true anymore, but he says in Long Island, the bridges over the roads are extremely low. They're like never over 9 feet. And you think, oh, isn't that quaint? He says, and actually other people did this research, Moses did that to prevent buses from being able to go to Long Island and pass Long Island to the Hamptons, right? So it was a designed attempt to keep buses out of this area. And who rides those buses, right? People of color, people who don't have the means to have a car, whatever. People who don't live in the Hamptons. Technical arrangements are forms of order, and these are forms of power. He also talks about Cyrus McCormick's Reaper manufacturing plant in Chicago in the middle 1880s. I did not know this story. He says that McCormick installed these new pneumatic molding machines. Okay, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a machine, largely untested, extremely expensive, $500,000 in 1880. And in the standard interpretation of these things, we would think, oh, that's a technological advancement, right? Designed to make the product less costly, more efficient, etc. Not so. He quotes the historian Robert Ozon, who shows that McCormick was at the time engaged in a battle with the National Union of Iron Molders. And he saw the new machines as a way to weed out the bad element among his workers. In fact, it was an expense that he never recouped because he was after something else. He didn't want a more efficient product. You know, the story about the ruthless business efficiency of CEOs and owners of factories. No, he spent $500,000 in the 1880s to get rid of a union, right? So technological arrangements are forms of order, and they are inherently political. He says this: the adoption of a given technical system unavoidably brings with it conditions for human relationships that have a distinctly political cast. How could they not? For example, centralized or decentralized, egalitarian or inegalitarian, repressive or liberating. This is ultimately what is at stake in assertions like those of Lewis Mumford, whom he quotes, the two traditions of technology, authoritarian or democratic. In all the cases, he says, I cited above, and he cites more than what I told you about, the technologies are flexible in design and arrangement, relatively, and variable in their effects. Although one can recognize a particular result produced in a particular setting, one can also easily imagine how a roughly similar device or system might have been built or situated with very much different political consequences. The idea we must now examine, he says, and evaluate is that certain kinds of technology do not allow such flexibility, and that to choose them, knowing that they have this lack of flexibility and that there are at least these effects you can see ahead of time, is to choose a political position, an ideology. For example, authority is inherent in some technologies. It's inherent. And you know who said that was Frederick Engels. Frederick Engels, he cites him and he says, you know, anarchism is great, but somebody's got to be able to steer the ships. And not everybody can steer the ships. Winner's example is much more contemporary. Nuclear power plants. You don't want just anybody in a nuclear power plant. Like Homer Simpson should not be messing around, but he gets paid to be there. The nuclear power, certain technologies create a technical elite by their very nature. And so if you're going to go, here's his point, if you're going to go with a certain technology, you are creating a powerful elite, people who know how to drop nuclear bombs or build nuclear plants. And he ends, and again, this is in 1980. So he has a brief section on egalitarian technologies, which then was solar. And there were great environmental movements centered around solar power. And the idea that this could be distributed, because it's the sun, right? We all have access to the sun. The point is, corporations are going into areas that in 1980 they couldn't have imagined. For example, they couldn't have imagined that we would be drinking water out of bottles when it's right there in the tap. But we do. All right. How users are used. Ivan Illich. Now, if you're like me, a literature person, you're like, wait, Tolstoy's Ivan Illich was a technical theorist? No, this is a different guy. And the title of his book is a really happy title. Tools for Conviviality, 1973. But of course, he's making, he's using the word differently. Right at the beginning, he says, look, I've been criticized for using this word conviviality because it means a kind of happy-go-lucky, bubbly kind of thing. He's like, I mean it in the etymological sense of living together, to conviva, to live together. So tools for living together is really a better title. And the book is about this. And this is what he says at the beginning in the introduction. When an enterprise grows beyond a certain point, it first frustrates the end for which it was originally designed. It frustrates that end, and then rapidly becomes a threat to the society it was supposed to serve. And he says, and this book is about, identifying these scales and the parameters of our human endeavors in relation to the tools we use. This is a great book that I haven't finished, but I want to. Really interesting approach here. He says there are two major points, pivots, I think he uses the word pivots, in the human relationship to technology. One was 1913. I'm thinking, what happened in 1913? Nothing. He says this: the year 1913 marks a watershed in the history of modern medicine. Obviously, a very intimate way that technology and humanity interact. Around that year, a patient began to have more than a 50-50 chance that a graduate of a medical school would provide him with a specifically effective treatment than someone else. Because medicine before 1913 was largely done by just people who were not credentials, because there were no medical schools. I mean, there were medical schools. He's saying this is the tipping point. But think about the history of humanity on the planet. Who has been our doctors? Well, mostly women, frankly. Medicine men and women, shamans, people who can see differently, like our doctors do now. He finishes this point by saying, many shamans and herb doctors familiar with local diseases and remedies, trusted by their clients, had always had equal or better results before 1913. That's the point at which Western medicine caught up to non-Western medicine. Or, well, yeah, let's just leave it there. And then the second pivot point, he says, is that this new medicine, this discourse, this technological discourse of medicine and treatment, ended up creating new kinds of diseases. I hear murmurs of assent out there. He writes this: the exclusion of mothers, aunts, and other non-professionals from the care of their pregnant, abnormal, hurt, sick, or dying relatives and friends resulted in new demands for medical services at a much faster rate than the medical establishment could deliver. As the value of the services rose, it became almost impossible for people to care. Simultaneously, more conditions were defined as needing treatment by creating new specializations or para-professions to keep the tools under the control of the guild. Medicine creates its own disease, its own problems, to which it creates its own solutions. Again, sorry that's not relevant now, but you know, right? All you have to do is watch an ad for a drug. You're like, oh shit, I feel that way. I better get that drug. And then you see the side effects and you're like, yeah, all right, I'm going for it. So what he's calling for is a conviviality, a way of living together, using tools. I love that he calls it tools, because that's techne, right? Techne, tools for living together. And he says this: I mean conviviality as autonomous and creative intercourse among persons. And the intercourse of persons with their environments. This almost sounds too quaint now. And this is in contrast with the conditioned response of persons to the demands made upon them by others and by a man-made environment. I consider conviviality to be individualized freedom, realized in personal interdependence, and as such, an intrinsic ethical value. I believe that in any society, as conviviality is reduced below a certain level, no amount of industrial or technical productivity can effectively satisfy the needs it creates. The needs it creates. We were fine. I mean, yeah, we didn't have some things and maybe our lifespan was shorter, but we were okay. And he actually has a long section on that, how quality of life got lost to quantity of life. And he uses that as an example of how the technology lost the conviviality for the sake of its own, not for the sake of the care of the people. That wasn't their concern, right? Sure, it's better to live longer most of the time, I think, probably. But that wasn't the point. The point was to take this new power and to extend it, and to maintain it and to extend it into new areas. And so now we have to have laws to create assisted suicide, for example, because now it is against the law. All right. We're going to get into some weird stuff tonight, aren't we? It's going to be awesome. The evidence shows, this is Ilyich, the evidence shows that used for this purpose, machines enslave people. Neither a dictatorial proletariat nor a leisure mass can escape the dominion of constantly expanding industrial tools. So again, 1973, he's thinking industry. The crisis can be solved only if we learn to invert the present deep structure of tools. Deep structure of tools, right? You ever think about that? The deep structure of tools? You're not supposed to think about it. You're just supposed to use the tool. But to think about the deep structure of tools. If we give people tools that guarantee their right to work with high independent efficiency, thus simultaneously eliminating the need for either slaves or masters and enhancing each person's range of freedom. People need new tools to work with rather than tools that work for them. They need technology to make the most of the energy and imagination each has, rather than the more well-programmed energy slaves. There's this critique of technology out there that we don't ever hear about. I remember some poor guy years ago at the dawn of the internet. I want to say his name was Clifford something. He had this wild, crazy hair, and he was kind of crazy. And he's like, this is bad. This is bad. The internet is bad. I don't know if anybody remembers him. I don't know where he is now, but his voice is gone, right? I should look him up. And of course, feminists have offered some very powerful critiques and theories of technology, such as Sandra Harding right here in UCLA, who developed the philosophical position of standpoint empiricism, which, I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but empiricism is supposed to be independent of where you stand. It's supposed to be true no matter who's looking at it, where, or when. But she argues quite convincingly that that's not possible, that you must always take into account where you're standing and who you are and when and what language you're speaking and what gender you are, for example. It's a cultural version of the Heisenberg principle, right? And of course, feminist critics of technology, I mean, this should be said, that technology has more than any other, well, I shouldn't say more than any other thing, there's religion, but is largely monopolized by men. That's changing, of course, like most things, but not without some difficulties. And so feminist critiques of technology point out the male in the machine, right? That's an old phrase, the God in the machine, but they point out the male in the machine because remember, this is not male bashing, this is a critique of our understanding of technology and how assumptions about gender were never examined. And they were just built into the machine. And so feminist theorists want to talk about these gendered technologies. And we can talk about it tonight too. So I always like to see what our founder had to say, who died in 1990. There he is in our special collections reading. And of course, he was, as always, prescient. He says this: the miracles of religion are denied or discredited, but the miracles of technological progress are treated with considerable respect. I would go further. They are treated as miracles. I mean, the language that is used about this, that's an iPhone XR, which has an extra long battery life. Look at the discourse surrounding this stuff that I use too, you know. I'm part of it too. It is the language of religion. It is the language of awe and miracle, right? In the midst of a highly confused galaxy, there is a tendency to overlook the essential purpose of knowledge. I love how he just brings it right back. The proper end of learning is the improvement of humanity. Hello? Isn't it? Shouldn't it be? The enlargement of understanding to the end that we can live together in peace and harmony. And this is often overlooked, he says. So here are 5 ideas and one intertitle from Fritz Lang's great film. Technology is human. We said this at the very first lecture. As long as we see technology as out there, we saw it in the mythologies and the etymologies we use for technology. As long as technology is something out there, not connected to us, it owns us. It actually, more accurately, the people who understand that technology is human will own us. And we will be their slaves. These types of binaries, technology, human, right? They create power. That is the history of Western culture. Binaries creating power, because binaries are never binaries, they're always hierarchies. The binaries are never equal. Male, female, good, evil, light, dark. They're never equal. They're always, one is always, in critical theory, we call it the subaltern. It's less than. One is always less than. Power takes the shape of culture. And so there's no power that does not work through cultural elements like technology and gender and religion and class and ethnicity. Because again, technology isn't out there, it's in here, and we're using it. And so power takes the shape of culture. And so changing technology changes culture. Again, we mentioned this at the very first talk, how writing has restructured human consciousness, I think, unlike anything else. Writing has. The fact that you can communicate outside of yourself into an object, and another person can derive meaning from that object that is outside of both of you. That restructures human consciousness. And culture changes technology as well. And this is the intertitle. I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. But Courtney, you probably know, and some film people probably know. It's where you, on a film, this is Metropolis 1927, where they put this on the film. It's text that's put in the film. I'm not describing it well, but it's like a title. And this is from that film. The mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. See, we know. We've always known. We get all caught up and riled up and lost in this or this that I'm using or this electricity, but we know. We've always known. We have stories that go back thousands of years, knowing that there's always a danger of selling our souls to the devil for this knowledge. And I'm also glad we have people like Lewis Mumford and Langdon Winter and Manly Hall and feminist critiques of all this to remind us that we've always known and that there's always a way out. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this interesting topic.